When you're in a Claude session, every message you send and every response you get back, Claude stores it and uses it as context. And with every prompt you send, the entire context gets sent along with it. So the longer your conversation gets, the more tokens you use. However, your messages aren't the only thing that consume your tokens. There's a lot of other stuff running in the background, and to see where your tokens are going, just run the context command with the all argument to see all the details. So in my case, the context is using 21,000 tokens, and only 8 of those come from the messages. And most of the tokens come from things you can't control, like the system prompt and tools. Those are there from the start, so there isn't much you can do about it. However, you can always reduce the total token count, even if it's just a little bit. And a good place to start is by trimming the Claude files. So together these files take up about 400 tokens, and at this size it's still pretty efficient, but it starts to add up once you get into the thousands of tokens. And the same applies to everything else, so also your skill files. You should try to keep everything as lean as possible. Now, the context uses 21,000 tokens. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be charged for all of them. And that's because Claude Code uses something called prompt caching. And if you don't understand how prompt caching works, you'll end up wasting a lot of tokens. So the way it works, when you send your first prompt, it has to load everything that you see here, and you'll be charged for all those tokens. However, after that, everything gets cached, and Claude Code just reads from the cache at roughly 10% of the cost. So I have 21,000 tokens in the context, so on my next prompt, it will only use 2,100 tokens. However, the cache only lasts for a limited time, which is 1 hour if you're using Claude Code via a subscription, and only 5 minutes if you're using the API. But as long as you keep prompting it within that window, the timer will keep resetting, so the cache will remain active. So my advice is to try to finish your task in one go, so you don't keep wasting tokens because the cache expired. Also, right now I've only got 8 tokens in messages, but as the conversation goes on and it builds up to, let's say, 100,000 tokens, I'm still only paying 10% for Claude to read them from the cache. However, if I leave the session and revisit it after an hour, the cache has already expired. So on the next prompt, I have to pay the full price for all those messages. And this brings me to my next tip, and that is to avoid working on older sessions, especially those that have a very long chat history, because that first prompt back is often really expensive. Alright, now time isn't the only thing that kills your cache. You will also lose your cache the moment you change the initial setup. For example, you shouldn't change the model while you're in the middle of a task, because each model has its own cache, so at the moment you switch to a different model, it has to reprocess the whole conversation, which can get really expensive. And the same goes for changing the effort level, connecting or disconnecting an MCP server, or denying an entire tool in your permissions. So I would recommend setting everything up the way you want before you start your task, so you don't have to change anything later. Now, finally, when you're working on a large task with multiple subtasks, the tokens it spends on messages can add up pretty fast. So after you finish each subtask, what I recommend is to run the compact command, and that will summarize the conversation, which saves you on tokens while still keeping most of the context.